Today I'm going to talk about some traces of perhaps a lost civilization, and these will look primarily at scientific traces and also at spiritual traces of that civilization all around the world. I believe we are a species with amnesia. I think we have forgotten our roots and our origins. I think we are quite lost in many ways, and we live in a society that invests huge amounts of money and vast quantities of energy in ensuring that we all stay lost. A society that invests in creating unconsciousness, which invests in keeping people asleep so that we're just passive consumers or producers and not really asking any of the questions. And I found for me the study of the past and the mysteries of the past has been a liberating process in terms of looking at the present. This is the world, of course, as it looks today. We're very concerned about such issues as global warming, climate change, and coming earth changes, which many have intuited. But if you go back 21,000 years, you will find that the world looked very different. There were gigantic ice caps covering the major land masses. The ice over North America, this huge ice cap, was actually 2 miles deep. Can you imagine that? 2 miles of ice sitting on top of New York City? Well, I don't know, but that's how it was. Same in Come Closer. I mean, just an extraordinary thing. Nobody could live there. Any traces of whatever was underneath it were ground to dust by the weight of that ice. Europe, the same story, a gigantic ice cap, bigger than Antarctica, covering the whole of Northern Europe, just an extraordinarily different world. This is our world today with its familiar contours and outlines, and this is the world at the end of the last, not the end, but at the last glacial maximum, 21,300 years ago. There was no Red Sea. There was no Arabian Gulf. The Indian coastline was greatly extended. Sri Lanka joined onto the tip. Southeast Asia was a whole continent that is now underwater, just reduced to the Malaysian peninsula and the Indonesian islands. Altogether, 10 million square miles of land were above water then that are underwater now. And 10 million square miles of land, that's the whole of Europe and China added together in terms of area. So this was a very serious change that took place in the earth when we went from that to this. And it was a change which unfolded over a period of about 10,000 years, but sometimes it was extremely cataclysmic. It wasn't just a slow drip, drip, drip of the ice sheets. What would happen on top of those 2-mile-high ice caps is that you would get a gradual accumulation of meltwater in glacial lakes on top of the ice caps. And this would perhaps accumulate for 4,000 or 5,000 years before the boundaries surrounding it broke, and the huge explosion of water poured down off the ice caps, reaching speeds of 1,000 kilometers an hour, coming down, tearing over the land, destroying the landscape, rushing into the sea, and raising sea level. 30-foot, 40-foot rise in sea level overnight happened twice during the last ice age. We can imagine what a 30 or 40-foot rise in sea level would do to our civilization today if it were to happen overnight. I believe it would bring it instantly to an end. Now, we have traditions, myths, stories from all around the world of an all-destroying global flood. And the tendency of academics is to say that these stories are just... What happened was there was some little local flood, and the people in that area imaginatively elaborated it into a global flood. I don't think I need such an explanation when I know that there were global floods at the end of the last ice age, when the whole world was flooded again and again and again. And I do believe that the flood myths from all around the world, amongst which, of course, I include the story of Atlantis, are a memory of real events recorded in myth and tradition. It's rather interesting that Plato, who is the earliest surviving source for the story of Atlantis, tells us that he got it from his relative Solon, who in turn got it from the ancient Egyptians, and that they spoke of a time 9,000 years before the time of Solon. That's 9,600 BC, or 11,600 years before the present, when the wonderful civilization of Atlantis was destroyed in a single terrible day and a night by flooding and earthquakes. Academics think that Plato made it all up, but if Plato made it all up, it's extraordinary that he chose that date and that time, around 12,000 years ago, because that was absolutely at the peak of the meltdown of the last ice age, when there was indeed global flooding. The story is all over the world. In India, it's the story of Manu, the Indian Noah, rescued from the flood by Vishnu. In Greece, it's the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The same thing, a couple who regenerate mankind, surviving the flood, riding it out in a box that rides along the waves. The Maya, too, had this story of the end of the last world age and the whole Mayan concept of cyclical time, and what goes around comes around fits in with this very, very strongly. Here's the story of Noah from the Bible. And if you want to find the origins of the story of Noah, you need to go to Sumer, the land that is now Iraq, where the Epic of Gilgamesh, almost 5,000 years old, tells essentially the same story that is told in the Bible, of a warning. One man warned, the gods are angry with mankind, they're going to send a flood, you must save what you can. It's the story of Gilgamesh, the story of the Gilgamesh epic. Interestingly enough, if you go to the Arabian Gulf, where the Gilgamesh epic comes from, and you look at the situation at the end of the last ice age, this was the Arabian Gulf at the last glacial maximum. This is not sea. This is a river. This is the combined streams of the Tigris and the Euphrates running through the otherwise completely dry Arabian Gulf, which formed a kind of Garden of Eden. It was one of the most wonderful places to live on Earth at that time, when most of the rest of the world was extremely arid and very inhospitable. And then, around 12,000 years ago, very, very quickly, the whole Arabian Gulf became flooded. So I think that if we see a flood story from that region talking of a global flood, it's pretty easy to understand where it came from. It came from what happened. It's a memory. It's not a myth. Australia, that's how it was at the last glacial maximum 21,000 years ago, with that gigantic tip of Southeast Asia nearby. That's how it is today. And again, the Aborigines of Australia, who've been in Australia for 50,000 years, have myths and traditions of global floods. A great flood serpent which ate up the land. It's put into symbolic language, but again, it's a memory of what happened at the end of the Ice Age. Now, one of the things, when I first began to explore these mysteries 20 plus years ago now, one of the first things that struck me was what I call the mystery of the maps. That there are certain maps that have come down to us from antiquity, which show the world not as it looks today, but as it looked during the last Ice Age. And whenever you look into the story of these maps, you find that they were copied from older source maps, typically between the 13th and 17th centuries. So the maps that we look at are relatively recent. They date from the 13th to the 17th centuries. But when you find their origins, you find that the map makers drew on many source maps which are no longer available to us. These ancient maps seem to record the world as it looked 20, 15,000 years ago. This was the level of map-making technology in the 7th century in Spain, and indeed in the 13th century. These are called TO maps because of the shape. They're quite pretty, but you definitely would not want to navigate by them. They're really bad for navigation. Actually, east is up on these maps. This would be Jerusalem, center of the world. This is the Mediterranean. Here's Spain. Here's North Africa. As I say, pretty but useless. However, that map's from 1283, and round about that time, end of the 13th century, flooded into Europe a whole new set of maps, and nobody really knows where they came from. Ptolemy's maps, we know of Ptolemy, of course, but he himself, 2,000 years ago, was drawing on earlier source maps when he created his maps. And those maps disappeared during the Dark Ages. They were preserved in monasteries, and they came to the attention of mariners at the end of the 13th century. They're not as good as modern maps, but they're very good, and you can navigate by them. Another mysterious group of maps appeared at that time, and these are the so-called Portolans, the Portolan cartographic tradition. This is the Pisan chart from 1280. It's the earliest surviving example. That's Italy there. You're coming into Spain and North Africa here, and the Holy Land there. What's remarkable about these maps is that they incorporate incredibly precise latitudes and longitudes. Now, latitude is a relatively easy thing to do, simply by measuring the height of the sun or stars above the horizon, but the pole star above the horizon specifically. But longitude requires technology. It requires a chronometer that can maintain accurate time as the Earth spins. And our civilization was not able to do longitude until the late 18th century. And that's why many mariners, before the longitude problem was cracked, would end up bumping into coastlines that they didn't expect to be there because they'd done their calculations wrong. But weirdly, in these older maps, highly accurate longitudes. How do we explain that other than as a heritage from an earlier map-making tradition? Charles Hapgood, his work on the maps of the ancient sea kings, is really the best source on this material. And he's suggesting that the Portolan tradition came through a predecessor of Ptolemy, Marinus of Tyre, perhaps through Ptolemy, stored in the Library of Alexandria. When the Library of Alexandria was burned down, some of those maps went to Constantinople. Crusaders went into Constantinople and took away some of those maps and reintroduced them to the world. That's roughly the suggestion here. I think everybody's heard of the Piri-Reis map, which is a Portolan map. And here we see South America's east coast, to be compared there, the west coast of Africa, and down here at the very southern tip of South America, a continuous landmass that appears to be Antarctica on a map dating from 1513. And it's really a puzzle if you find Antarctica on maps from the 16th century, because our civilization didn't discover Antarctica until the early 19th century. Here's Antarctica as it looks today, and here's Antarctica as it looked around the year 1800 in this map from Russia, which shows no Antarctica at all. And it's not there because we haven't discovered it in 1800. We didn't discover it until 1818. Yet if you go back to the 1600s and the 1500s, Antarctica is all over ancient maps. There it is in this beautiful work of Orontius Phineas, a rather accurate depiction of the continent of Antarctica. And here again, a map by Mercator, everybody's heard of the Mercator projection, a great map maker. Here again, Antarctica, present in that map. Both of those maps, the Orontius Phineas map and the Mercator map, drew on earlier source maps, now lost to us. Is it possible that those earlier source maps may go back to an earlier civilization, one that had the technology to explore the entire globe, to map it mathematically in a way that we can recognize today as highly sophisticated, because that's what these maps seem to show. Here's one of those Ptolemaic maps, not quite so good as the Portolands, but still pretty good, and interesting, really, to look at Southeast Asia and how Southeast Asia is represented in this huge landmass here, and to compare that with, well, there's Southeast Asia today. There it is on that map, and here's how it looked 21,300 years ago. And I find a really remarkable similarity between what the geologists now tell us Southeast Asia looked like 21,000 years ago and what it looks like on this map, even with the tip of the Australian landmass coming into the image right there. Another Ptolemaic map from 1513. Off the British Isles and off the island of Ireland is a little island here. Can you see it? This little island is called High Brazil. Lots of people believed in the existence of High Brazil. I know personally of 2 expeditions that were sent out from Bristol, which is a town very near where I live, to look for High Brazil. But they couldn't find it because they didn't need a ship to find it. They needed a time machine. You have to go back 13,000 years to find High Brazil. And that's where it was. The geology shows us quite clearly, with lower sea levels at that time, this landmass was exposed around 13,000 years ago, the landmass that is shown on that map. And let's go back to the Piri Reis map again. On it, right up here, there's an island which doesn't exist. Not today, anyway. And on that island, there's these curious stones side by side. You see them there? That island is in exactly the place where Bimini is today. And underwater off Bimini is the famous Bimini Road. I think that that's what's shown on this image here, how it looked before it was flooded at the end of the Ice Age.